Okay, so we are going to make a tutorial here now for completing the container with a locking lid. So, just like last time, I'm already into TinkerCAD. So I'm going to go to the Learn tab. And again, if a reminder, if you haven't used this platform before, please go to the starter lessons and complete those. But the purposes of this video, we're going to jump into the project section. And we're going to scroll down till we find the locking container. And we're going to go to the first lesson, building the locking container itself, and we're going to get started. Okay, so step one, place a cylinder on the work plane and make it 80 by 80 by 3 millimeters. So we'll grab our cylinder, and again I'm going to use that same trick from the time capsule. I'm going to select my sizing node and then click on the measurement and type in 80 and 80, and then select my upper node for the height and change that to 3, just so I make sure that I can get accurate measurements. If you want to keep the measurements refined, depending what you're working in, it's going to be controlled by your snap grid. So because I have my snap grid right now set to 1 millimeter, every time I drag a cursor up an interval, it's going to make an interval change of 1 millimeter. If I change that snap grid to half of a millimeter, for example, now every time I do an interval change, it's going to go up by half millimeter intervals. So something to keep in mind and play around with depending on how precise of an alteration you're looking to make to a shape. But again, real quick and easy way is just selecting the node and typing in the measurement you want. Moving to the next step, we're now going to look at going to the shape generator, and we're going to look for the extrusion shape. I'm going to do this just to show you how it works and where the shape generators are, but I'm going to show a trick actually that'll work a little bit easier than using this extrusion piece. So at the top where the basic shapes are listed, if I go down to shape generator, I can go down to featured, and then I can find the extrusion shape. And the neat thing with the extrusion shape is it brings me my object, which begins to look like a cylinder at the start, but it gives me in the inspector window a drawing of the shape, and I can manipulate this object by dragging these cursors, and I can create unique objects to suit a need based off my design. Now I said that this is one way that you can do this to create the shape. I'm just going to back this up so it's back to its original state. And I believe in the instructions it says to drag the cursor to turn it into a boomerang type object. So we would just drag one of these sides over to make it kind of look like a boomerang. But instead of doing that step, what I'm going to do is show you a little trick using the basic shapes still. Is I'm just going to bring another cylinder on. But I am going to follow the same step and reduce the height of that cylinder to the same 3 millimeters of my lid cylinder. So I'm going to change that 20 to 3, drop that down, and then instead of bringing the boomerang just to the edge, I'm going to use the alignment tools. So I'm going to take alignment here and I'm going to center the objects, okay, and then I'm going to put them on the left edge. And then what I'm going to do is just take that large cylinder and I'm just going to move it over. And what I can do with this is just set it to about halfway over, so that positive measurements moved to the right, so I want to move it over to the left, so I'm going to put in a negative measurement so that the center of the new cylinder, which should be a 20 millimeter diameter, is now going to have the edge of the larger cylinder in the middle. And that is going to work a little bit easier for us. If you want to take it even further, we can move the object even further, so I can move the small cylinder or the large cylinder. I wouldn't go more than a total of 15 millimeters from when they were lined up on the outside edge, just so that your tab is going to be able to connect. This is why we do this step instead of the extrusion shaped as a boomerang, is the boomerang shape is conforming somewhat to the outside edge of the large cylinder. And that doesn't guarantee that the pieces are going to mate together when we go to group them later. By having the overlapping circles, this guarantees that these two pieces are going to bond together and create the shape that I want. Okay, so just remember that we went somewhere near the center at that 10 millimeter interval, or up to 15 millimeters from when the outside edges were matched up. So I'll move on to the next step. Now it's asking me to once again go into the shape generator panel, and it's looking for the twisted polygon. So I'm going to go back to that shape generator. And in this instance, I believe it's actually, instead of in the featured category, it's going to be in the all shapes. And if I remember right, it's somewhere near the end of the list. Go to page 7. There it is, the twisted polygon. So we'll bring that in. And then the twisted polygon, it asks to place it on the work plane and increase the height from its default of 20 millimeters to 23. And it makes a note here that you want to make this change in the inspector window instead of physically selecting the node and then changing that height or dragging that node to change the height. Go to the inspector window and go to the height measurement here and type in your new measurement of 23. This just works better because it's going to change all of the parameters of the object instead of just affecting that height. Because we're working with a shape that has a number of points, it has a twist applied to those points. By changing the height of the object in the inspector window, it's affecting all of those other increments and measurements on the object, as opposed to if I just drag this, it's going to change the height of the object only, and it could throw off the threading that we're going to create with this twisted polygon. So next step is to hold down the shift key, and then we're going to be centering these objects together. So we're going to look to center the large cylinder onto our twisted polygon. So for right now, we're just going to have to remember that measurement that we used for attaching that smaller cylinder. So I'm going to select my two objects. I'm going to center them together. And then on the next step, it's looking for me to change the measurements of that twisted polygon. So I'm going to select only the twisted polygon, and it wants a set of 8 points instead of 7. It wants a radius of 35. It wants the height to be dropped back down to 20, now that I've changed some other increments on here. Bottom twist is going to be 10 degrees, and my top twist is going to change to minus 10 degrees. We'll continue to the next step, and now it's looking for me to start playing around with the next bit. So here's again another little trick for you, because I want to get this tab back onto my object. So what I can do is actually take my large cylinder and my twisted polygon and group them together, and now they're one. And then I'll do the exact same process for aligning that small cylinder to my large cylinder. So I'll go back to align, I'll center them front to back, align them on the left edge, and then I'm just going to do that same movement. And I'm just going to reset this to 0 so that they're not moving that alignment front to back. And I'm going to go minus 15 to put it right back to the position that it was in again. And if I want to with this lid too, I can further group these objects together, because that will complete the object of the lid. And then I'll move it to the back corner. And I believe it's going to look for me, if I remember right, on the next step to duplicate this object. So I'm going to make a duplication here, move this into the window to work with. And because I'm actually going to be end up deconstructing this second lid, I'm going to ungroup it. So I have all three shapes again, but they'll still be in the same position. And even if I wanted to, I could ungroup this lid at the back for now, although I'll leave it together. Now this does complete this part of the lesson. One tip that I will give to you here is select all the objects you've made thus far, go up to the top tool panel and choose copy, or on your keyboard you can push Control C, and then we're going to go on to the next lesson. What sometimes happens that I've commonly encountered is when we move on to the next lesson, it doesn't actually move your shapes over into the lesson. So you can see right now my work plane is empty, and if I move into the steps to start creating that next piece of my container, those objects haven't been moved in, but because I've copied them, I can now paste them in, and I have them to work with. Okay, so I'll just put these back into my work plane, and the starting point here is I'm going to be looking to back working with that large cylinder from that spare lid that I made a duplication of. So I'm going to move the twisted polygon off to the side. I'm going to move my little smaller tab cylinder off to the side, and then I'm going to take this large cylinder and I'm going to be increasing its height to 50, and then it's asking me to make a duplication of that shape. I'm which I will drag off to the side here beside it. And it's going to be looking for me to change the measurements of this object so that the sides are 65 millimeters and the height of this object is also going to be 65 millimeters. And at the next step, it's now going to look for me to align those two cylinders together. So I'm going to select those two cylinders. And I'm clicking and dragging over the two objects that I want to select. I can also follow the steps that are explained in the instructions on the left, and instead of doing that selection is I could just select one object, hold the shift key on my keyboard, and select the next object by clicking it. Both methods work perfectly fine. Just the only trick is with the method that I've been using, be careful not to drag over other objects because it will make it a part of the selection. So I'm going to select those two cylinders. I'm going to go to my align tool. We're going to center front to back, center left to right, and get those objects together. It's also asking on step 4 here to take the cylinder that's the smaller diameter, taller height, and raise it up 3 millimeters. So we'll select that object, and we're going to take the little movement cone and drag it up 3 millimeters. Next step here, we are going to be taking the inner cylinder, that smaller diameter, taller object, and we're going to turn it into a hole, and then we're going to select both of these cylinders, and we are going to group them together. So it's going to take that hole and cut it out of our larger diameter cylinder. Okay, so now we're going to be taking the extra thread piece and put it into place. Now it asks you to set the work plane to the top. It's really not necessary to do that. I'll show you another trick here, but first we'll follow the steps that are described here. So we're going to set the work plane to the top of the cylinder. So I hit the W key on my keyboard. I move my mouse so it's over the top of the cylinder and click to select the top of the cylinder as the new area for the height of the work plane. Now I can select that twisted polygon, select the D key on my keyboard, which will drop it to the top of the work plane, which is at the same height as the top of the cylinder. And then it's looking for me to change this object. So the radius of the threads now is going to be 36 from 35, and I'm doing that again in the inspector window. So that'll make this a little bit larger for these threads to accept the lid. Okay, so now I'm going to dismiss the work plane. So again, I hit the W key. I'm just going to click away from my work plane, drops it back to the original location, and then it's going to look for me to center the threads with this cylinder, and then it wants me to turn this new polygon shape that I'm going to be removing from this object into a hole and drop it down 20 millimeters. So I'm looking for that negative number that's right beside my mouse to get to 20 millimeters. There it is. And then by selecting these two objects, I can group them together to cut those threads out. Now, an alternative option, as opposed to doing the work plane positioning, is quite simply all I do is take my twisted polygon, also select my cylinder, go to my align tool, align it left and right, align it front to back, and align it at the top. Okay, it'll accomplish the exact same thing. It guarantees my edges are aligned together. Group that object, and it'll do the same thing. Next step here is to get this cylinder into position with this base of my container. So again, it's wanting me to do the work plane trick, but instead we're going to apply that same trick that we used on the lid piece. So I'm going to select the small cylinder and the large cylinder. We're going to use those align tools. We're going to center them front to back. We're going to center them on the left edge, and then we're going to move the large cylinder over. So again, I'm going to reset this front to back movement to 0 so that it's staying that centered front to back, and then I'm going to subtract that same 15 millimeters so it's in the same place as where my container lid has its little tab. And then again, to bring this tab up to the top, I'm just going to select my two objects, go to the align tool, and bring it up to the top with the top alignment tab. Okay, which now I believe takes us to the final step for the actual construction of these objects, which is to group that tab to the container. And then it's going to be looking to put a hole in the tabs so that we could put a lock. Okay, so at this point it's wanting me to take the base, flip it over 180 degrees, and I'm also going to rotate it around 180 degrees so that the tab's on the same side of both objects. I'm going to get all of my objects selected. We're going to line these up centered left and right, centered front and back, and then we're going to be moving to the next step, which is taking that same extrusion piece and then making a unique shape to cut out. Instead of that, again, I can do this step. So we'll go back here, take the extrusion piece, and it's wanting a unique shape so that this is not going to interfere with the side of the container. So I can pull this over, make a unique shape again, making sure that a lock could pass through here. Or because I've moved this beyond center, I can do a very similar process to what I did to create this tab, which is just take the pre-made cylinder that is a hole. We'll shrink it down in size so that it's about 10 by 10 as the instructions say. And then we can even further this one more time. I can take all of my objects, go to my align tool, align these so it's centered. I can align this on the left, and then I could further take that over. So again, I'm just gonna take that back to 0, and we'll -5. That does put it a little close to the container side, so maybe we'll only subtract 3, and that's putting it near the center of my tab. Now before I cut this hole out of the tab, I have to remember that I have a lid and a base, so I want to make a duplicate of my hole. And then all I'm going to do is select one half of my container, hold the shift key, select one of those two holes that I've made, and group them together. And then I can move that object off to the side, and I'll take my lid and my other hole that I've made, group those together, and now I've got two matching holes. And the reason that this is nice is, like I said, the tab overlaps the cylinder that makes up the lid or the body base of the container, so that allows to guarantee that they are going to in fact line up. The other thing that's nice with this too is that when I line these up again, so I'll center these front to back, I'll center these left to right. If I turn the base into a hole so we can see through it, you'll see that everything lines up. My lids line up, my tabs line up, the hole for the lock lines up, the threads line up, and because I made the threads in the base a little bit bigger, there's a little bit of a gap and it's evenly spaced all the way around. If we did this with the extrusion method of creating that boomerang shape, lining them up, and just as best as we could lining them up by eye, this spacing wouldn't have the equal distance all the way around as it does here. It would probably be a little bit off. So I'm going to turn this back into a solid. And that completes this part of the locking container. So at this point, it's just separating the two objects so that they're not connected, so that they could be sent off as an STL file for the printer. But there is still one last lesson left for this project. So once again, I'm just going to select all my objects. I'm going to make a copy of them to move over to the last lesson, which is making this a unique container, making it your own. So again, because I brought it over into the next lesson, it hasn't brought my objects over, but because I've copied them, if I paste them by selecting the paste button or Control V on my keyboard, now I have my objects and I can start to add some details. So I'm going to flip my base over here, and then I'm going to add something onto this object. Now, typically, when we look at our options, it's adding basic shapes, it's adding text, which we added to the time capsule. This time I'm going to look to add something a little bit more unique, which I believe someone in the group has already done before with the time capsule, but I'm just going to open up a new tab and I'm going to search for an image. So I'm going to search for the Shaftesbury Titan logo, actually. And we've got a Titan head that comes up. So this is going to work perfect for what our application is here. So I'm just going to save this image as. Now, in order to complete this step, you have to have an image that's going to be a black or white. So I don't have that right now. So I'd either want to search and use this Titan head here that's black and white, but I'm going to show just some further steps. So if I open up Photoshop and launch this program here to create that black and white image from what I have, I'll just show you the steps. So I'm going to go back to TinkerCAD for a moment, and then I'm going to bring Photoshop into view, keeping TinkerCAD in the background. I'm going to create a new document here, and I'll bring that window over so you can see what that looks like. So I'm just going to make an object here that's about 2 inches by 2 inches, resolution at 300, CMYK is perfectly fine, RGB would also be acceptable for color mode, and I'm going to create this new document. I'm going to place my Titan head photo. I'm going to go to my downloads. I'm looking for that Shaftesbury picture that I have. There it is. I'm going to right click on that layer and rasterize it. And then really simply all I'm going to do is just use my magic wand tool to delete the background. And then I'm just going to start taking the red out of the design. Now, if I was looking for this to be a really high quality print, I would want a really high quality image. You can see as I'm selecting the red area, parts of the red are not being selected, which means that I'm not going to end up with nice clean edges. So a really clean image is going to go a long way here by choosing something that has a higher resolution type to it. I'm also going to remove the white sections here that I can, just to make this a little bit easier for me here. And then the last thing I'm going to do is start looking to select the open spaces that I selected by holding the Shift key. I'm just going to add to that selection. And this isn't going to look great, but for the purposes of our video here, this is going to be good enough. So I'm going to get these details all selected. Perfect. I'm going to inverse the selection, and I'm going to fill it in as a black color fill. So here's my fill. I'll select black. There we go. I'm going to inverse it one more time, hit delete to delete everything that I didn't have selected. And then I will save this image as a JPEG. And we'll just call it Titan BW for black and white. And when we're saving these images, it's going to be important too to make sure that you have the maximum quality. So we just drag this little cursor bar over to get that quality set. And then I can exit out of Photoshop. I'm not going to bother saving the changes to the Photoshop file. And then back on my TinkerCAD window, I'm going to open up a new window, and I'm going to go to online-convert.com. And I'm going to go to the image converter, and I'm converting this image into an SVG file. So once this loads up, I'm going to go to choose files. I'm going to look for that Titan image that I just made, which was Titan BW for black and white. Choose that one. And then we're going to go to start conversion. And what it's going to do is it's going to change this JPEG into an SVG file, which is a vector file, which we can bring into TinkerCAD. So it's already saved it for me. And then I'm going to go back to TinkerCAD, and I'm going to go to import. Choose a file. I'm looking for that SVG file I just created. And one thing that's going to be important with this is looking at the size. 600 by 600 is pretty big, so I probably want to go about 25% of that scale just to be able to work within my work plane. I could probably go smaller, like 5%, 30 by 30 now. Let's import that. And that's going to bring my Titan head in. and it's created it as an object just like any of these basic shapes that I have in TinkerCAD. So now what I can do with this Titan head is rotate it up and turn it around so it's pointing the same as the container here. And I can align these two objects together. So we'll center them, put them on the left edge like this. We'll center them up and down as well. And then what I can do with the Titan head further, zoom here, is I can take the Titan head, and if I want to, I can pull it out a little bit further so that it protrudes out more or less from my object. I can bring the inside in so that it's going to be matching but not cutting into my threads at all. And then I can choose to group this onto my container and have it extrude out from my container, or I could turn this into a hole and I could cut it out from my container. So that would be cutting it out. And again, based on the shape of the object, you can see here it didn't cut out cleanly because of the fact that I have a round object. So this is probably going to be a better choice because of what I've got for a size of an image here, to instead of making this Titan head be a hole, make it be a solid and have it extrude out from my container. And there we go, I got a Titan head extruding out from my container. Put that container base back on the work plane. Got my two objects ready to go. I'm going to export these as an STL file, and these are ready to go to EDSB for marking, or if this was my project, it's ready to go to EDSB to then take to Cura for printing. So this concludes the TinkerCAD tutorials for our projects. So again, you have to complete the time capsule, which was looked at in a previous video, and now you've got this new one for the container with the locking lid, and then you've got designing your project for what you're going to be 3D printing. All right, folks, that's what we've got for today, and as always, pitter patter.